The late autumn wind carries the first promise of snow, a sharp, metallic scent that scours the hollows of the Blue Creek Basin. It whips around the corners of Eleanor's small cabin, a lonely sentinel on 100 acres of stubborn, unforgiving land. She stands on her porch, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other resting protectively over the pronounced swell of her belly. The world has shrunk to this small patch of earth, this cabin filled with the ghosts of laughter and the heavy presence of her late husband's absence. Samuel has been gone 6 months, the victim of a falling widowmaker in the logging camps to the north, and his silence is a sound she has yet to grow accustomed to. The wind rattles the window panes, a familiar percussion against the quiet hum of her solitude. But tonight, there is another sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. It isn't the scuttling of a raccoon or the burrowing of a woodchuck. It's hesitant, desperate. It comes from the cellar door, the slanted, heavy oak boards set into the earth at the side of the house. Eleanor freezes, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Men on the road are a rarity, but rarely a good sign. Vagrants, drifters, men fleeing the law or their own bad luck. She is a woman alone, visibly pregnant, a beacon of vulnerability in a vast and indifferent wilderness. She backs into the cabin, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. The scratching stops, replaced by a silence more terrifying than the sound itself. She holds her breath, listening. A soft sob, thin and fragile, is carried on the wind, so faint she almost mistakes it for the cry of a night bird. It is the sound of a child. Every instinct screams at her to stay inside, to bar the door and feed another log into the fire. The world is full of traps, and a lone woman cannot afford to be compassionate. But the memory of Samuel's kindness, the feel of a new life kicking within her, wars with her fear. She cannot leave a child to face the coming frost. With the poker clutched in her hand, she slowly opens the cabin door, the cold air rushing in to bite at her ankles. The moon is a sliver, casting long, skeletal shadows from the skeletal pines. She moves toward the cellar door, her bare feet numb against the cold ground. The sobbing has stopped. She strains to listen, hearing only the whisper of the wind and the pounding of her own blood. Reaching down, her fingers trembling, she finds the iron ring and pulls. The heavy door groans open, revealing a square of profound blackness. And from that darkness, 2 wide, terrified eyes stare back at her, reflecting the sliver of moonlight like shattered glass. It's a boy no older than 10, his face smudged with dirt and tears, his clothes little more than rags. He doesn't speak. He just shivers, a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Her fear evaporates, replaced by a wave of fierce, undeniable pity. To help him is a risk. To turn him away is an impossibility. She lowers the poker and extends a hand. "Come on," she whispers, her voice raspy. "Come inside before you freeze." The boy flinches but doesn't move. Her heart breaks for him. She knows in that instant that this small, trembling fugitive is about to become her secret, and that in offering him sanctuary, she's inviting a danger far colder than any winter storm into her life. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The boy remained in the square of darkness, a silhouette of fear. Eleanor understood. Trust was a currency he didn't possess. She softened her voice further, making it a low murmur, the same tone she used to soothe a spooked horse. "I won't hurt you. It's warm inside. There's stew." The word stew seemed to land with some weight. His shivering intensified, a product of more than just the cold. Slowly, like a fawn testing uncertain ground, he crawled out of the cellar opening. He was smaller than she'd first thought, his frame bird-like beneath the tattered shirt. He kept his eyes on the ground, as if afraid to meet her gaze. Inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloped them. She pointed to a small stool by the fire, and he scurried to it, huddling close to the flames. He still hadn't said a word. Eleanor ladled a generous portion of rabbit stew into a wooden bowl, the one Samuel had carved for her their first winter together. She placed it on the floor beside the boy, along with a hunk of stale bread. She didn't press him, didn't ask his name or where he came from. Questions were threats. For now, food and warmth were the only language they needed. He ate with a desperate, animal-like hunger, scooping the stew with his bare hands, not seeming to notice the heat. When he was done, he looked up at her for the first time, his eyes a startlingly clear blue in his grimy face. There was no gratitude in them, only a deep, bottomless exhaustion. "You can sleep here, by the fire," she said quietly. "In the morning. We'll see." He gave a small, jerky nod and curled up on the rough-spun rug, his body tight as a fist. Within moments, he was asleep. Eleanor watched him, the rise and fall of his thin back, and felt a profound ache. He was all sharp angles and jutting bones. Someone had been starving him. She banked the fire and retreated to her own bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She was harboring a fugitive. She didn't know his crime, but the state of him suggested he was running from something terrible, not just toward something better. Every creak of the cabin walls, every howl of the wind, sounded like hoofbeats, like the arrival of the law. The next morning, the world was dusted with the first fine layer of snow. The boy was already awake, sitting exactly where she had left him, watching her with those unervingly silent eyes. "I have to go into town," she said, her voice more brisk than she intended. For supplies, it was a test. She wanted to see if he would panic, if he would try to run. He merely watched her, his expression unreadable. "You will stay here. Don't touch anything. Don't make a sound. If anyone comes to the door, you get back in the cellar. Do you understand?" He nodded. "The cellar," she repeated, pointing. The moment you hear anything, another nod. The town of Prosperity was a single muddy street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings. It was a place that survived on logging, trapping, and a healthy dose of gossip. As Eleanor guided her old mare, Daisy, down the main thoroughfare, she felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. The pregnant widow, a subject of pity and speculation. At the mercantile, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was perpetually at war with her curiosity, measured out flour and beans for her. "Hard winter coming, Eleanor," she said, her voice laced with concern. "You all right out there on your own?" "We're managing, Daisy and I," Eleanor replied, forcing a small smile. She bought more than usual, extra beans, a slab of bacon, and a small bag of horehound candy she thought the boy might like. "Expecting company?" Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes lingering on the size of the order. "Just stocking up before the heavy snows," Eleanor said smoothly. "Harder to make the trip when you're... well, you know," she gestured to her stomach, a convenient and undeniable excuse. It was outside the mercantile that she saw him. Sheriff Brody. He was a tall, stoic man, fair in his dealings but unbending in his adherence to the law. He was tacking a notice to the public board outside his office. He tipped his hat to her. "Mornin', Eleanor. Hope you're keeping well." "Sheriff." She nodded, her heart starting a low, heavy thud. She tried to walk past, but her eyes were drawn to the paper he'd just posted. It was a bounty notice. Wanted. Runaway. 10 years of age. Named Finn. Fled from the care of his lawful guardian in Cedar County. Considered a thief and a vagrant. $50 reward for his return. $50. It was a fortune. More than enough to see her through the winter and the birth. Enough to tempt any of her struggling neighbors. Her blood ran cold. Finn. His name was Finn. She felt Brody's eyes on her and forced herself to look away from the poster, to keep her expression neutral. "Trouble from Cedar County?" she asked, her voice impressively steady. "Seems so," Brody said, his gaze sweeping the street. "Some runaway boy. Stepfather's a man of some import, Silas Croft. Says the boy is a bad seed, stole from him and ran off. Just want folks to keep an eye out. He's probably long gone by now, but you never know. I'll be sure to keep my door locked," Eleanor said, a bitter irony in her words. She untied Daisy's reins, her movements stiff. She could feel Brody's gaze on her back as she led the mare away. She had a name for her secret now, and a price for his betrayal. The journey home felt 10 times as long. The small cabin no longer a sanctuary, but a cage she had willingly locked herself inside with a boy worth $50. When she returned, the cabin was silent. For a terrifying moment, she thought he had gone. Then she saw the cellar door was shut tight from the inside. He had listened. Relief warred with a fresh wave of anxiety. She opened the door and called his name, her voice soft. Finn! He emerged, blinking in the daylight. She didn't tell him about the poster. She didn't tell him his life had a price tag. Instead, she handed him one of the whorehound candies. He looked at it, then at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. He took it hesitantly, as if expecting it to be snatched away. He put it in his mouth, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crossed his face. A small, tentative softening. It was a minuscule victory, but it felt monumental. That night, a fever took him. He'd been too long in the cold, his small body too depleted to fight it off. His shivering returned, but this time it was violent, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. His skin was hot to the touch. Eleanor knew she couldn't leave him in the damp, cold cellar. It would kill him. Cursing her own soft heart, she gathered him up. He weighed almost nothing and carried him to her own bed. He was delirious, muttering broken words she couldn't understand. No, please, dark. She spent the night bathing his forehead with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He was so fragile, so utterly broken. The thief and vagrant on the poster bore no resemblance to the child trembling in her bed. Sometime before dawn, his fever broke. He fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair, watching him in the pale light, the poker resting against the wall. She was no longer just a woman hiding a runaway. She was protecting a child. The distinction was crucial. It shifted the foundation of her fear into something harder, something more akin to resolve. Let Sheriff Brody and his posters come. Let Silas Croft and his $50 go to hell. They would have to get through her first. The days bled into weeks, and a fragile routine began to form, dictated by the rhythm of secrecy. Finn recovered his strength, the hollowness in his cheeks filling out. He was still quiet, a ghost in her house, but his silence was different now. It was less the silence of terror and more the silence of observation. He watched her knead bread, mend Samuel's old shirts, chop wood with a grim determination that made her back ache. He followed her like a shadow, a small, constant presence. He never went outside. The world beyond the cabin walls was a threat. His domain was the hearth, the small corners of the single room, and the dark, earthen-smelling safety of the cellar. The cellar became his den. He spent hours there, and Eleanor would find strange little arrangements he'd made, pebbles sorted by size, twigs laid out in patterns. It was the play of a child who had never been taught how to play. Their first real conversation was about a book. It was Samuel's copy of Robinson Crusoe, its spine cracked and its pages soft with use. She was reading it by the fire one evening, her lips moving silently. Finn sat on the floor, watching the flames. "What's it say?" he whispered. The sound of his voice, after so long, was startling. It was rough and used. Eleanor looked down at him. "It's a story," she said gently, "about a man who gets shipwrecked on an island, all alone." Finn considered this. "Is he scared?" "At first," she said, "but then he learns to survive. He builds a house. He finds food. He makes a new life. He's a runaway," Finn stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Eleanor's heart clenched. "I suppose he is," she said carefully. "Running from the sea." From that day on, a trickle of words began. She started teaching him his letters, scratching them with a charred stick on a piece of smooth pine board. He was a quick study, hungry for the shapes and sounds. It was a way for them to talk without really talking. A for apple, B for bread, C for cellar, F for Finn. She never pushed him for his story. She knew it would come when it was ready, or not at all. Her role was not to be his confessor, but his guardian. The pregnancy was advancing, her body growing heavier, her movements more cumbersome. The simple act of hauling water from the well left her breathless. One morning, She was trying to split a stubborn log of pin oak, swinging the axe with more frustration than force. It was awkward and dangerous. Suddenly, Finn was there. He took the small kindling hatchet from the woodpile. He didn't say anything. He just began methodically splitting the smaller branches she'd already chopped, stacking them neatly by the door. It was a small gesture, but it was a turning point. He wasn't just taking shelter anymore. He was helping provide it. They were a team. A strange, broken little family of two, soon to be three. The outside world, however, refused to forget them. One afternoon, she saw Sheriff Brody's horse tethered outside the Miller place, her nearest neighbor, a full mile down the valley. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her. He was still looking, still asking questions. She herded Finn into the cellar, her hands shaking as she pulled the door shut over him. She went back inside, forcing herself to sit at the table and resume her mending, her needle trembling in her fingers. An hour later, a knock came at the door. It was Brody. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, his face etched with a weary sore duty. "Eleanor," he said, "sorry to bother you." "Sheriff, is something wrong?" she asked, her voice a marvel of calm. "Just doing my rounds. That runaway boy, Finn. His stepfather, Mr. Croft, he's come to town himself. He's very determined to find the boy." Brody shifted his weight. "Offering $100 now. He's convinced someone in this valley is hiding him. $100. A life-altering sum. Enough to buy a new team of oxen, to hire a hand for the spring planting. Enough to make a good person consider doing a very bad thing." $100 is a lot of money for a troublesome boy," Eleanor said, her tone carefully neutral. "That it is," Brody agreed, his eyes scanning the area behind her, past her shoulder into the dark interior of the cabin. "Mr. Croft seems to think the boy is more than just troublesome. Says he has a vicious streak. Stole some valuable heirlooms." Eleanor met his gaze, her own expression a mask of weary innocence. "Well, I haven't seen anyone, Sheriff. It's just me out here. As you know," Brody nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Of course. Just keep your doors locked, Eleanor. A boy that desperate, there's no telling what he might do." He tipped his hat again and left. She watched him right away, her legs so weak she had to grip the doorframe for support. The lie sat like a stone in her stomach, heavy and cold. The threat was no longer a piece of paper on a board. It had a face and a name. Silas Croft, and he was getting closer. That night, the first heavy snow of the season began to fall. It came down in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the world in white, erasing the road, erasing the tracks, cocooning the small cabin in a sheath of temporary safety. Inside, the fire crackled, a warm heart against the cold. Finn was sitting by the hearth, tracing letters on his pine board. He looked up at her, his blue eyes serious. "He's lying," Finn said, his voice barely a whisper. "Who's lying?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. "The man. The one the sheriff talks about. Croft." It was the first time he'd said the name. "I didn't steal nothing. Not from him." Eleanor sat down on the floor beside him, her large belly making the movement awkward. She waited. The story, she sensed, was finally ready to be told. He wasn't my real pa," Finn began, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My ma, she married him after my pa died of the lung sickness. He had money, a big house. Ma said we'd be safe." He fell silent, his small jaw tight. She wasn't safe. He told the story in halting, broken pieces, the words tumbling out as if they'd been dammed up for years. He spoke of Croft's cold, quiet cruelty. Not loud rages, but methodical punishments. Meals withheld for imagined slights. Long hours locked in a dark pantry for making too much noise. His mother had tried to protect him, to shield him, and had earned Croft's displeasure for her efforts. "She got sick," Finn whispered, his voice cracking. "A cough like my pa. But she wasn't that old. She should have gotten better." He took a shuddering breath. "Croft, he wouldn't get the doctor from town. Said it was too expensive. He got some traveling man with a bag of powders. Ma got worse after that. She died in her sleep." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She reached out, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, then leaned into her touch. He told everyone he was heartbroken. Finn continued, a bitter, adult-like cynicism in his voice. But I saw him. The night she died. He was looking at her jewel box. The things my real pa gave her. He wasn't sad. He was counting. The final piece of the story was the one that had sent him running. A few weeks after his mother's death, a hard-faced man had come to the house. Finn had overheard them talking. Croft was arranging to have him indentured, sold to the man to work in a mine hundreds of miles away until he was 21. A slave in all but name. He said I was an expense he wouldn't carry any longer. Finn said, his voice flat with a pain too deep for tears. He was going to sell me. So I ran. I took some bread and a bit of cheese. That's all I stole. Bread and cheese. He finally looked at her, his eyes swimming with a desperate need to be believed. He'll kill me, Eleanor. If he finds me, he won't let me tell anyone what he did to Ma. Eleanor pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapping around his bony frame. She held him tight, her own child kicking gently inside her, as if in agreement. This was no longer about hiding a runaway. This was about shielding a witness. This was about standing between a terrified child and a man who was very likely a murderer. The snow fell harder outside, piling up against the door, but she knew it couldn't protect them forever. Sooner or later, Silas Croft would come knocking. And the $100 bounty was no longer a reward for a runaway. It was a price for a boy's silence. The snow provided a temporary reprieve, a fortress of white that kept the world at bay. For 2 weeks, the cabin was an island in a sea of snow. In that isolation, a new dynamic settled over them. Finn, unburdened by his secret, began to change. The haunted look in his eyes receded, replaced by flashes of a normal 10-year-old boy. He helped her with chores without being asked, his small frame surprisingly wiry and strong. He learned to bank the fire just right, to check her rabbit snares, to mend a tear in his own trousers with clumsy, determined stitches. He even learned to laugh. It happened one afternoon when Daisy, the old mare, managed to sneak her head through the partially open cabin door and steal a biscuit right off the table. The sudden, brazen act was so absurd that a short, sharp bark of a laugh escaped Finn's lips. It startled them both. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide, as if he'd committed a crime. Eleanor just smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "It's all right, Finn," she said softly. "Laughter is allowed here." After that, it came more easily, small chuckles at first, then full-bodied laughter that filled the cabin with a sound it hadn't heard since Samuel was alive. Eleanor found herself talking to him constantly, telling him stories about her own childhood, about Samuel, about the baby growing inside her. She let him press his hand against her belly to feel the baby kick, and his eyes had widened with a solemn, profound wonder. In hiding a child, she had found a companion. In protecting him, she had found a purpose beyond her own grief. This small, secret family, forged in fear, had become real. But the thaw, when it came, was swift and merciless. The snow melted into a thick, clinging mud that made the world accessible again. And with the passable roads came the return of the threat. It arrived not as a sheriff, but as Silas Croft himself. Eleanor saw him from the window. 2 men on horseback, picking their way up the muddy track toward her cabin. One was Sheriff Brody. The other was a large man in a thick wool coat and an expensive hat, his face set in a mask of grim authority. "Croft." Her blood turned to ice. "Cellar," she hissed. "Now, Finn, don't make a sound." He scrambled for the door without a word, his face pale, his brief period of childhood snatched away in an instant. She slammed the heavy cellar door shut, kicked a rug over the seams, and smoothed her apron over her belly, taking a deep, fortifying breath before turning to face the door. The knock was loud, imperious. She opened it to find Sheriff Brody looking uncomfortable and Silas Croft looking right through her. "Ma'am," Croft said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. "I'm Silas Croft. Sheriff Brody tells me you live here alone." "I do," Eleanor said, her body forming a barricade in the doorway. "We are searching for my stepson," Croft continued, his eyes doing a slow, invasive sweep of her property. "A troubled boy who has run away. We have reason to believe he may have sought shelter in one of these outlying homesteads." "I haven't seen any boy," she said, her voice hard. "The sheriff has already asked me." Croft's lips thinned into a semblance of a smile. $100 is a significant sum, ma'am. It could be a great help to a woman in your condition. Perhaps it might jog your memory. The insinuation, the oily mix of bribery and threat, ignited a cold fire in her chest. "My condition, Mr. Croft, has not affected my memory. And my husband, God rest his soul, did not leave me so destitute that I need to trade a child's life for your money." Brody had the grace to look ashamed. Croft's eyes narrowed. "He is a thief and a liar. He is my property, by law, until he comes of age. Harboring him is a crime." "Then I suggest you find him," Eleanor said, her hand resting on her stomach. "Because he is not here." She held his gaze, a silent battle of wills waged on her doorstep. Below her feet, she could feel a faint vibration, a silent prayer that Finn was staying absolutely still. Croft looked from her defiant face to her swollen belly, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. A physical confrontation with a pregnant widow, even for a man like him, would be a foolish move. "We'll see," he said, turning away. "Sheriff, we'll check the outbuildings." She stood in the doorway and watched them search the small barn, the smokehouse, every corner of her small world. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The cellar. The cellar was part of the house. Did they have a warrant? Could they force their way in? When they found nothing in the outbuildings, Croft strode back toward the house, his face dark with anger. "I wish to search your home, ma'am." "Do you have a warrant, Sheriff?" Eleanor asked, her voice shaking only slightly, her eyes locked on Brody. Brody cleared his throat. "Now, Eleanor, we don't need to." "I believe I do need to," she interrupted. "This is my home. You're not entering it without a warrant from a judge." She was gambling. Gambling that Brody's inherent respect for the law was stronger than Croft's influence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Croft looked as if he might shove her aside, but Brody put a restraining hand on his arm. "She's right, Mr. Croft," the sheriff said, his voice low. "We need a warrant to enter her home." Croft stared at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a venomous promise. "This isn't over," he snarled, before turning and mounting his horse. They rode away, leaving Eleanor. He was a man of influence and money, and she was a poor widow. The law would not be on her side. Hiding was no longer enough. Running was impossible. There was only one option left, a desperate, long-shot gamble that would either save them or condemn them both. She had to fight back. She had to get the truth to someone who would listen, someone more powerful than a local sheriff and a corrupt, wealthy man. Her mind raced, searching for a name, a possibility, a prayer. And then she remembered Elias Vance, the journalist from the Capital City Chronicle who had exposed the railroad land grab 2 years prior. A man who, it was said, feared no one and could not be bought. He was their only hope. That night, by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, Eleanor began to write. Her hands, callous from farm work, felt clumsy holding the pen. But the words came, pouring onto the cheap fool's cap with a desperate urgency. She wrote everything. Finn's story of his mother's death, of Croft's cruelty, of the plan to sell him into indenture. She wrote of finding him, of the bounty, of Croft's visit and his threats. She laid bare the entire truth, omitting nothing, her own crime of harboring a fugitive included. She was not just writing a letter. She was writing an affidavit, a plea, and a confession all in one. She signed her name at the bottom, the ink stark against the page. It felt like signing her own death warrant or their salvation. There was no in-between. The next morning, she faced the most dangerous part of her plan. The letter had to get to the regional post office in Somerville, a full day's ride away. She couldn't send it from Prosperity. Sheriff Brody or one of Croft's men would surely see it. She had to leave Finn alone for a full day and a night and pray that Croft didn't return with his warrant in her absence. "Finn," she said, her voice grave, "I have to leave. I'm going to try and get us help." She showed him the letter. This is our only chance. You have to be brave. Keep the door barred. Don't answer it for anyone. Not for any reason. I'll be back as soon as I can." He looked from the letter to her face, his young old eyes understanding the weight of the moment. He just nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Be safe, Eleanor," he whispered. She saddled Daisy, her body protesting every movement, and tucked the precious letter deep inside her coat. The ride was agonizing, a torment of physical discomfort and mental anguish. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats behind her. By the time she reached Somerville, dusk was falling. She posted the letter, her hand trembling as it disappeared into the slot. There was nothing more she could do. She had thrown her stone into the pond. Now she could only wait for the ripples. The ride home the next day was worse. The fear of what she might find, or not find, was a physical sickness in her stomach. As she crested the final ridge and saw her cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees washed over her. He was all right. She found him inside, the door still barred, sitting by the fire with the poker across his lap. He had been standing guard. They didn't speak of her trip. There was nothing to say. The deed was done. Now they waited. The days that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. Every sound was the arrival of the law. Every sunset felt like their last. The waiting stretched for a week, then 10 days. Hope began to curdle into despair. The letter hadn't worked. No one had believed her. Croft would come. It would all be over. Then, on a cold, clear afternoon, they came. Not 2 riders, but 4. She saw them from the window. Sheriff Brody was in the lead, but behind him were 2 strangers in city coats, and bringing up the rear, his face a mask of triumphant rage, was Silas Croft. This was it. He had his warrant. "The cellar, Finn," she said, her voice strangely calm. The time for panic was over. He scrambled down, pulling the door shut. Eleanor walked to the cabin door, unbarred it, and stepped out onto the porch, her hands resting on her belly. She would meet them in the open. She would not cower in her own home. "Eleanor Gray," Sheriff Brody said, his voice flat and official. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a warrant to search this property and to take into custody the fugitive known as Finn and to arrest you for the crime of harboring him." Croft smiled, a cruel, satisfied twist of his lips. "The game is over, ma'am." Eleanor looked past him, past Brody, to the 2 strangers. One was a tall, severe-looking man with a deputy's star pinned to his coat. The other was younger, with an intelligent, watchful face and a notepad in his hand. Elias Vance. It had worked. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She held her ground. "You can search my home, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "You will not find the boy." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's a clever one. He's in the walls, I'd wager," or under the floorboards. He started toward the door, but the deputy from the Capitol stepped forward, blocking his path. "Mr. Croft," the deputy said, his voice carrying an authority that made Brody's sound feeble. "You will remain here." He turned to his companion. "Mr. Vance, if you would." Elias Vance stepped forward, his eyes on Eleanor. "Mrs. Gray, my name is Elias Vance. I'm a reporter with the Capital City Chronicle. Your letter reached the governor's office. He was most interested in your story, and in Mr. Croft's." Croft's face went from triumphant to confused. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Vance ignored him, his attention still on Eleanor. The governor launched an immediate inquiry. "We discovered that your husband, Samuel Gray, had written a letter to a magistrate just before his death, detailing unsafe practices at the logging camp owned by Mr. Croft's silent partner. A very convenient accident, your husband's death." Croft paled. Vance continued, his voice relentless. "We also looked into the death of your second wife, Mr. Croft, the one you said died of a lung sickness. It's amazing what a proper doctor can determine, even after the fact when a body is exhumed. The town physician in Cedar County now recalls you purchasing a significant quantity of wolfsbane from him for a pest problem, a poison that in small doses mimics the symptoms of pneumonia." Silas Croft was no longer smiling. He He looked like a trapped animal. This is slander. Lies concocted by a runaway brat. That's not what your former housemaid says. The deputy cut in, producing a folded piece of paper. Her testimony confirms the boy's story. The beatings, the starvation, and the fact that you burned your wife's diary the day after she died. He unfolded the paper he was holding. It was not a search warrant. Silas Croft, I have here a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of the murder of Mary Croft and for numerous counts of fraud related to your business dealings. Croft stared at the warrant, his face collapsing. The power, the arrogance, the authority, it all drained away, leaving a pasty, terrified shell of a man. And as for the boy, Vance said, turning back to Eleanor, his expression softening. And for you, the deputy produced a second document, this one bearing a large, ornate seal. By the authority of the governor of this territory, he announced, his voice booming in the quiet valley, a full and unconditional pardon is hereby granted to the boy known as Finn for any and all alleged crimes. And a full pardon is granted to you, Mrs. Eleanor Gray, for the crime of providing him shelter. The governor sends his commendations for your courage. Sheriff Brody looked at the ground, his face burning with shame. Croft made a strangled sound and lunged, not at the lawmen, but toward the woods, a desperate, futile bid for escape. The deputy was faster, tackling him to the ground and binding his hands with grim efficiency. It was over. The threat was neutralized, the truth brought into the light. Eleanor stood on her porch, her hand on her belly, and watched them lead Silas Croft away in irons. Justice had come to her small, lonely cabin. She turned, her legs weak with relief, and went to the cellar door. "Finn," she called, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's all right. You can come out now." The door creaked open, and he emerged, blinking in the bright, clean afternoon light. He looked from the retreating figures to her face, his eyes searching for confirmation. She knelt, with some difficulty, and held out her arms. He ran to her, and for the first time, he hugged her not as a scared refugee seeking shelter, but as a son embracing his mother. She held him tight, breathing in the scent of earth and dust and freedom. Above them, the sky was a vast, brilliant blue. The snows were gone, and spring was on its way. In the quiet of the valley, a new family had been born, not of blood, but of courage, compassion, and a love that had taken root in the darkest of places. She looked out at the land, Samuel's land, her land, their land, and knew that they were finally home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.